My name is Claire Nicholas White, and I'm the widow of Robert White, Sculptor. When we met, it seemed very obvious that we were to meet because he was going to be a sculptor and his family was just as much steeped in the arts thanks to his grandfather, Stanford White, the house full of artwork. His first great influence on Bobby was going to Germany. In 1932, I think it was, the Depression in here, his father had no work, he was an architect, and there were these 8 children that needed to be educated, and it was much less expensive to do that in Germany. So they went and they stayed in a wonderful castle, which was the school. And he was studying with a German woodcarver called Hans Gart. I think he went to Munich to take his carving lessons, but he was already drawing and doing woodcuts of animals. And when he came back to America, he told his father he was going to be a sculptor at the age of 12. He was then sent to the Portsmouth Priory School in Rhode Island. So after a few years in Portsmouth, he was not a great student. He was often sitting up in a tree or sailing or whatever. But art study was his main interest. So he went, even before he graduated from high school, he went to the Rhode Island School of Design, where Howard Benson was teaching. And there was also a German sculptor who had been very successful in Germany, but left when Hitler came in power, and because his wife was Jewish, and he was the sculptor teacher at Rhode Island School of Design, and became very important in Bobby's education.
I'm Christian White, Robert White's son. Often say that I grew up in Bobby's studio. Most of my childhood and adolescence I spent many hours in the studio while Bobby was working, doing projects of my own or helping him. I recall was the St. Anthony, which he was doing in plasticine. It was a very large figure. I remember being struck by the physical job of producing this large figure, and although I was quite young at the time. But for a large part of my youth, he was working on the St. Michael and the figures of Joseph and Mary for a church. I remember Bobby working on the Mary, the Virgin, for the St. Michael group that he was carving. Those 2 pieces, they're in black walnut. They're fairly finished, traditionally carved pieces for Bobby. Anyway, I was watching him carve the back of it, and I said, "You're spending an awful lot of time on something that's never going to be seen, right? Aren't these pieces going to be against the wall?" And he looked at me with a kind of a disappointment that I would not understand why it was important to him to finish the back of this piece of sculpture, even though it wasn't going to be seen. So when people talked about purity, I always thought of that kind of lesson. A few years later, we were all in Rome, and we went up to the roof of St. Peter's Basilica. And if you go out on the roof, on the top of the facade, there are some travertine sculptures by Bernini, which are almost colossal sculptures. They must be 12 feet high, something like that. And I remember noticing that they were completely unfinished in the back. My reaction was to think, well, even Bernini didn't have the kind of purity that my father had.
My father, when he was young, he was kind of a wild man. He was very funny and very lively. Seemed kind of crazy, I guess, in a way, but had a lot of charm. Always a very good father, completely reasonable, completely the opposite of the image he often liked to give himself. I never remember one night when he didn't, at whatever hour they would come home, sometimes from a party in New York or something, he would always come to each of our rooms and be sure the window was open so that we would have fresh air while we were sleeping. And every morning, no matter what, he made breakfast every single morning. I mean, a real breakfast with orange juice, eggs, toast, bacon, whatever. And so he had this side of him that was very Virgo, I guess, very earthy and very someone you could count on, somebody. So he had sort of these two sides of him, luckily for us, I would say, because it was fun and yet reassuring.
I met him then when he was just out of the service, and we immediately began writing each other, and we were married in August 1947. His parents gave him this studio and the farmhouse in which we're still living, and so we've been here ever since, except for the best years of our life at the American Academy in Rome. In 1952, Bobby got the Prix de Rome, and in Rome he had a wonderful big studio, enormous. Rome itself was such an inspiration. Donatello became his great model and hero, and many of the Italian sculptors of the time, Marino Marini, Manzù was a wonderful sculptor who had a lot in common with Bob. I mean, Bobby's work was very much inspired by his. The craftsmen in Italy were so wonderful, so that casting statues, casting them in plaster and in bronze was so easy in Italy. There were such great craftsmen. Also, there were some wonderful sculptors there that became great friends. Well, Gil Franklin came from RISD to finish Ramish's statues, and then Jack Zajac, who arrived as a painter and became a sculptor. This often happened in Rome, that painters became sculptors, architects become sculptors. It really was in the air. Rome is so full of sculpture. I always thought that maybe the statues should be paying taxes because there were so many of them. Albert Weinberg was another wonderful sculptor. Miles was casting his big statues there at the time in another studio. So the atmosphere for sculpture was ideal.
So I'm Sebastian White, and I'm Bobby's eldest son. And unlike my brother and sister, I didn't go into the arts. I'm a physicist, a nuclear physicist, and I'm involved in a project in Geneva, the new laboratory, CERN. I'm most of my time at Brookhaven Lab on Long Island. Sometimes I work in this studio. Was Bobby's old studio. I like this room a lot. I like the light in it. I like that it has a lot of my father's works in it. And I tend to work pretty long hours. I like to work late in here.
Bobby always had two studios, as long as I can remember. He called one the clean studio, or the drawing studio, and the other one was for plaster. And he tried not to mix plaster and clay. So he used clay in one studio, plaster in the other.
Actually, the first time he used the other studio, which was a former garage of Stanford White's, which was high, and that's where he did his St. Anthony. That's the first time he used that studio, which later also he did the Pershing in. So this became more the studio for terracotta, whereas there, more plaster.
Of course, it was fun redoing this studio. I mean, it doesn't look like it's changed a lot, but there was so much, years of weird old tools in that chest. So you're sort of rediscovering, different things I used to do in the past. So this for sure was the studio where my father would start projects. For example, he would have someone out to do a bust of them, and he would be doing drawings and studies and maybe an initial attack at a terracotta before they'd break for lunch, and then he'd come back and finish it later. But if you would go to his other studio, then it was sort of more dynamic in a way.
And I spent a great deal of time, many years, trying to be able to learn how to draw, to be able to manipulate a figure, imagine a figure, imagine action of various kinds. Not a lot of people learn that kind of drawing nowadays. It seems sort of like a bygone skill.
I remember him very well, and I remember so well the way his hands would put the clay on. His hands were so like, that's what sculpture is. It had to have his touch, and he loved the actual physical part of making sculpture. I think for him it was really important. He really believed in craftsmanship too, and I think that was the difference between him and a lot of people today.
The ink drawings that I have in my office, I don't know how I came across them, but I really like them. And I don't like the other drawings as much. I mean, they're more rigorous or something than the other drawings.
Many people in the art world had enormous respect, not just for his work, but for his motivation, because he seemed to do his own thing, very uninfluenced by the times, by what went on around him. He was influenced by other artists, but he didn't follow anybody. He didn't follow trends. He almost never seemed to produce something which he thought somebody else expected or wanted him to do. And artists find that very compelling. It's rather rare. Most artists, if you ask them, will admit that they're heavily influenced by the marketplace. And Bobby was really just not one of those people. I know many artists really respected him, almost envied that quality.
There was a period when we had horses on the place, and my father was riding horses. And that was sort of fun diversion when we were doing that. He used to always go out in the field and chase the horses around.
He always had a horse. He loved to ride horses. And it became very much a subject of his. The Kangande statue, which is on Hofstra campus.
Well, of course, one of the interesting things about my father was his friends, the artists. They were really great. So that was always fun when people were visiting. There's no question that for us, the way our parents lived was a very strong influence for all of us. When we were kids, we used to sit on the staircase while my parents had parties and listen to the conversations and we liked the whole thing. And of course, it was very interesting the way both my father and mother worked right around here. So they had a special lifestyle.
Bobby and I had a long-running disagreement about art. He didn't really believe in working from life, or rather he thought that memory should always be involved. And Bobby's paintings, most of his watercolors, even of landscapes, were usually done from recent memory. A lot of his drawings are done from life, but he seemed to feel that his most serious work was all either a creation of his mind or done from memory. I guess I've started to understand why he felt that way. When I was young, working from memory or imagination was very limiting. But once you've accumulated a great deal of knowledge and information in your head, then observation can actually be inhibiting. What I'm saying is freedom is something you have to earn with knowledge in the arts. I think Bobby did that. He accumulated a great deal of knowledge, and it freed him to invent the figure in space.
My father and I both started getting interested in dance at about the same period. I was about 12 when I first started, and I don't know how old he was, but it was about in the 60s, and around 65, 66. And he had been asked to do some drawings of the Harkness Company. Rebecca Harkness had invited all the greatest dancers in the world. There was Eric Brun, Rudolf Nureyev. At her summer house in Watch Hill, she had studios made for them, and she invited composers also. And my father was the artist in residence, and he must have spent about 3 weeks or something there. And just drawing dancers. He loved it. He loved the dancers, and he loved drawing them. And my father got more and more involved drawing these dancers, and then he had to do a big sculpture of Rebecca Harkness herself with her partner, Robert Sievers, who was a very tall Texan dancer, so he could lift her very easily. After that, he did more and more sculptures of dancers, little ones, big ones. Sometimes I think he almost liked dancers more than dance itself. He loved being around them. It's something we had in common, liking the people, because I know some people talk about dancers, they're not interesting or they're so vain, but I think we both understood them, their qualities as people. My father's sculptures of dancers are really very personal, and there are some technical things that one can discuss, that the arms are not, because I think he would look at his own arm while he was actually doing the sculpture, and the way one holds an arm would be more like this with the elbow down. And dancers, we work very hard to get a line. It's a very complex thing to hold the arm correctly. There's all these different rotations going. This is that way, this is this way, and the hand is another rotation. And so he would look at his own arm and do it. But so it was not perfect technically, but the essence would be there.
Well, I like the portrait of myself, for sure. I was pretty young. Yeah, I don't really remember that. I must have been 12 or something like that. The idea, about it is that it's like, meditation. Like, was I meditating when I was that old? I don't know. Was I really that serious when I was that young? I don't know. No, but it's certainly, a very nice portrait.
When he was doing his last book on the Chinese poets, there's this one poem about the sword dancer, I think it's a sword dancer, that he was so excited about, and he had to do this drawing. He wanted to do a drawing of this sword dancer, and he just was something so incredible in his head that he wanted it to be able to portray that on paper. And I asked him, do you want me to try to interpret it? And he sort of thought about it, and then he said no. And he had to have it completely out of his own imagination, from the poem directly to him. When he did this portrait of me, it was not so long ago actually, and it's such a strict, stern person. It was sort of impressive for me to see that was his vision of me. I think it was a part of me that he saw that just came out. I don't think he even thought about it, because it's not very happy. I don't think it's sad, but I think it's very stern. He did a portrait of me when I was much younger, a terracotta, and it's very, very different from that. It's almost more sad, but very much sweeter. This is almost looks like a matador or something. He did it really quickly. I posed for it for about an hour or something only. What I love about his work also is it's very masculine, yet very, very sensitive. I love his terracottas almost more than anything. It's such a delicate, such a fragile media. You can't copy it. Like the bronzes, one can make copies, and they don't break very easily. But the terracottas are that's where you really feel his sensitivity. The scale of his terracottas was something for me very special. And his little portraits where they're just a little under the human scale. That's what's strange about mine. Well, Claire's too, is that they're bigger. Some things were smaller. Often he did children's under scale, and adults' heads a little bit more, a bit larger than life. But the terracottas were always smaller and so delicate. Dance of Death, he only did some of the pieces, but there was a whole plan. He never asked me to pose for those, and so I think it was really something that we each did in our own way. It was interesting. It was nice to have my father love dance that way.
I guess the processes that I most associate with Bobby are carving, which he was very traditional about. He never used chainsaws or anything like that, and many of his carvings are carved from a single piece of wood. Although the St. Michael group was laminated, but he really liked to just have a log and start from that. And the other process, which I think of being unusual to him, is the way he worked in direct plaster. He had a peculiar combination of modeling with a spatula, carving with a hatchet, and using rasps and stuff, so that a lot of his work has a surface which has a wide diversity of textures. I think that was very special to his work. I can't really think of anybody else who used that medium that way so much. As far as Bobby's process, he would have periods where he found it difficult to produce work, and he always said that he would get going by drawing. So I would say his process definitely started with drawing most of the time. He was a very virtuosic draftsman and taught drawing for many years at Stony Brook. And the way he draws and the way I used to draw are very different in that he was able to create images entirely from knowledge. And so many of his greatest drawings are not drawn from the model, but are imagined or remembered scenes, especially all the mythological subjects. So I think a big part of his process with mythology was drawing a theme, coming up with an emotional feeling for a subject. From there, he might do terracotta models, or sometimes he would go right from drawing to carving or to direct plaster. I've always been struck by the violent nature of all the mythological subjects that he was interested in. Even in the early bar scenes, there are some beautiful drawings of a bar fight, for instance. He seemed to be drawn to violence a little bit, and yet he was the most unviolent person you can imagine. I think some of it may have had to do with the fact he used to box when he was very young, and he described to me how he had really injured somebody in the ring. It had affected him quite deeply, and so maybe violence in the mythological subjects were a way of expressing a side of his masculinity which he didn't express physically. That would make a lot of sense. I actually like the barroom scene, which I've known since I was a child. I spent a lot of time restoring the plasters for that myself. I've spent more time with its creation.
Well, I really like the reclining drunk in the bar scene a lot. If you look at him, there's no mistaking that the guy is not somebody who sits behind a desk. He's a real, he has a back that's like, been doing real work somehow.
Bobby was an extremely facile portraitist, and he used to do demonstrations where he would do a terracotta portrait in an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. He did a lot of commissioned portraits, but the portraits which he did of his own family and friends have a different quality. There seems to be more ease to it. And this portrait of my sister, my younger sister, is it's small, but it so captures her character. From the point of view of the early 21st century, I think Bobby seems much more of a modern sculptor than he did in the 60s and 70s when the art world focused its attention only on what was different, whereas now people can see the kind of problems that someone like Bobby or his other contemporaries and friends, they all had this tension between realism and the power to invent. There was a whole group of artists who were really not so caught up in style, so caught up in the superficial. The group of artists that I think of as Bobby's peers were much less interested in that. They were much more interested in the basic problems of the art that they were trying to produce. And I think you could say that Bobby was in a way styleless. He was romantic, which was very unusual for his time.
Well, one of the things that he would sort of play around and invent things. I think, that idea of making all those medals, that was just something he thought about and then decided to do them. And he would design like his own candlestick holders and things. And then he had that wacky idea of making a sculpture of a sailboat with a guy sitting in it looking down at you over the dining room table. Those were so.
There's a semi-nude figure. I remember him working on that. That was done direct plaster, and it's probably one of the most finely finished plasters he ever did. It has a very, very tactile surface. I think of Bobby's legacy, I think to a great extent of how he affected people, how he affected other artists. So I think of a large group of artists when I think of his legacy. I think of, the work has a quality which is very rare for the time, for his time. This sense of touch on all his work, the sort of extensive comfort with classical techniques and knowledge and drawing, but without being derivative at all of other periods. I mean, his work is reminiscent of people like Rodin. He had an ease of form with the figure that I don't really associate with anybody else of his period. So I would say that, to me, that would be his legacy. I think he was unlike any of his contemporaries in the degree to which he was comfortable with figurative sculpture. Most other sculptors of his period, if they were figurative, had some stylistic or subjective gimmick of some kind, and Bobby didn't.
When an artist dies, one is left with a great deal of work. It was overwhelming at first. How would I manage this? I met somewhere at a lunch party, I met a woman who said, "Oh, I'll call my friend at the Smithsonian Art Archives, and she will take all his papers." So that was the first step. Many of his sketches, all his letters, which are now available in the Smithsonian Art Archives.
Somehow it would be nice if there was a way of remembering this talent he had for making portraits. Those terracotta portraits. That was really great. I wish he'd done more groups, like the bar scene and the dance. I think those are, there are questions about what to do with the things that are on our property. Should we move them to the big house of my cousins or stuff like that?
I guess that it would be as much of it as possible in a museum. I guess that's what one wants, isn't it? But it would be nice for it to be, I guess, the largest possible amount of his work in one place.
In history, perhaps he will be, I hope, remembered. I think he's a very American sculptor, for instance, even though his Roman influences were very strong, but basically it's very much based on American traditions.